Joining me right now is Keith Gabert from the Canola Council of Canada. Keith, how's it going?
Going well, Shaun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Keith, what do you do at the Canola Council?
I'm an agronomy specialist with the Canola Council, so between myself and a number of counterparts across the prairie provinces, we try to make canola growers the most successful they can be at growing this crop.
Nice. So how big of an area do you cover?
Well, I go wherever they tell me to, but technically I go from Ponoka to Oyen, follow the number 1 to the Saskatchewan border from Calgary.
Those are some different growing conditions.
Yeah, it keeps me on my toes.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we're heading into 2019. Obviously, a lot of growers they have canola in the rotation, like especially where we are here. This is canola is a very, very important crop. There's a lot of diseases, pests that should be really, really on our radar. We can't go any further without talking about clubroot, the management of that. Is that really been the biggest issue of the winter season as you've been talking to growers?
We've had a new push or new interest. It's funny when I talk about clubroot with growers. Your lights are a little too bright here, Shaun, but I can't see how quickly their eyes are going to glaze over. There's a line in the province at about Red Deer. At 5 minutes, their eyes start to glaze over if they're from north of Red Deer because they've heard about it for 15 years and they're not necessarily convinced that we haven't solved the problem already. If you get south of Calgary, it's a brand new problem. We've got some new fields found southeast of Calgary, which really increased some interest. We had 200 people show up at a clubroot meeting for the first time in my career at Indus this spring. Another find in Kneehill County. So we anticipate that clubroot is going to continue to spread. We've got 3,000 fields that are documented with clubroot. 150 of those are new resistance-breaking strains. So it's a disease that's difficult to manage, and I think we've got relatively few growers that have actually seen how bad it could be.
Right. And there's we've kind of gone through the ebbs and flows of best management practices over the years as it's gotten bigger. I think this winter, though, where we've really had a little bit of critical mass in terms of people really talking about it. I said earlier this week on the show, though, I think there's a lot of people talking about maybe getting a little bit more diversity into the rotation. Canola, canola, or canola snow canola is not necessarily the best practice.
Yeah, now you need to bite your tongue, Shaun. Sorry. I don't make those growers more successful.
But I am skeptical still that once we get to the field, will people follow through on putting more wheat, more feed barley, whatever it is? Will they actually follow through on it?
Yeah, so I've been with the Canola Council about 6 years. The first 3 or 4 years, growers would always tell me in November, I've pushed my canola rotations a little too much. I'm going to back off this year. And spring would roll around, and we'd have the same acres we had every year. So some real incentive to keep canola on the farm. It pays the bills. We understand that. But one of the things with clubroot that we've been talking to growers about is just using a clubroot-resistant variety, and we recommend that you start using a clubroot-resistant variety before you have clubroot in your community or on your farm, just to keep those spore loads low right off the start. Hopefully never get it on the farm. Just using a clubroot-resistant variety isn't enough of a management fix. So we want to talk to growers about finding that extra crop that pays the bills and they can include in their rotation to get a longer rotation. Some of the new information, if you haven't seen me present about clubroot in the last couple of years, is that I don't know if this analogy will work well over the radio, Shaun, but clubroot is a lot like frogs and tadpoles. So
please tell.
It's not like humans where you have your 2.3 kids or your 1.5 kids, and typically they survive to a ripe old age, and the population's relatively easy to estimate, and it tapers off when we all pick a magic age where we start to pass away. Well, clubroot is much more like tadpoles, where you have a million or a billion of them to start off with, and you know that your odds of success are relatively low. So new research out is that clubroot spores will tend to dramatically die off. 90-95% of them will be dead in the first 2 years. So that's not news that we were giving growers, or news we didn't know when we first started talking about clubroot. So when we told growers that clubroot spores could last 20 years, they looked at it and said, well, crop rotation isn't something we're even going to talk about then, because 20 years is too long of a time frame to think about. But when we talk to growers and say that growing canola 1 in 3 years, instead of 1 in 2, causes a significant drop in that clubroot spore level, and if you're at a manageable level to start with, so not talking about fields that are heavily infested where you see visible symptoms and you've got billions of spores in the soil, but if you're at a relatively low level of infestation, a 2-year break will get you back down to really manageable or quite low levels where hopefully the pressure on that resistance genetics that really has been working well for us is low enough that we don't break it.
when you're talking to growers, and we had a question yesterday on the app, the audience was asking us questions, was about blackleg, and the assertion was that a lot of farmers assume that blackleg is not a problem anymore because we genetically solved it. That is definitely not the case.
So yeah, you're right. When I talk to growers about diseases they can manage, I typically show a picture up on the screen, and it's got a stem where we've cracked it open to look at sclerotinia. I've got a cut section of the stem where it'll show you blackleg lesions or the discoloration in the stem, and I've got a root. If you don't have that picture in your mind of every canola field, you probably need to scout better. But we haven't solved blackleg. What we did, and I'm going to pick a date, but in the 90s we had some real issues with blackleg. We had a variety called Quantum come out with some really good genetics. After a few years, you couldn't sell a canola variety unless it had a specific trait or a real reason for you to grow it, unless it was at least a strong MR, if not an R variety. So we had at least 2 decades of really good blackleg resistance genetics that worked well for us, and growers simply forgot how to scout for that disease. So now we get invited to the odd field where when you pull the plants and start to cut right at the base of the stem, they've got significant disease ratings for blackleg. It's a 1 to 5 scale. It's not unusual for me to find the odd field with 3s and 4s in it, where the growers probably lost 17, 20 to 40% of his yield to blackleg already. Now, that doesn't mean that blackleg resistance genetics aren't working for Canada. In fact, one of our major trade partners is really concerned about blackleg. But if you've looked for that disease and watched to see if it's present, and if it's becoming an issue and becoming more of an issue in your field, there are some really good choices for blackleg genetics that you can rotate into. So one of the things that the Canola Council has helped to bring forward is a blackleg rating scheme, as well as some information on genetics that will talk about groups for resistance. So if a grower is growing a resistance group, and I'm just going to pick a letter A, and he's noticing that it's getting worse, typically this happens with a grower that's ignored all of my advice, and he's got a favorite variety that he's grown for 10 years, and it's been in the field every second year, maybe every third year if I'm lucky. But it's been the same variety through several canola cycles. If he had a little bit of blackleg that was successful the first year, the next cycle of canola, he's got a little bit more blackleg. He still loves that variety, so the third or fourth cycle, he's still growing the same variety, and suddenly he's got a blackleg issue. Well, it's still a great variety for blackleg resistance, but he needed to go to some different genetics. And in my experience, typically it's like flipping a light switch. You go from bad blackleg in that field, some new, successful genetics, and blackleg's a non-issue again. But for a grower, it cuts his yield, and it's a trade irritant that we should be staying away from.
Any new info over the winter about things like seeding rates and getting the proper emergence?
You know, seeding rates, one of the things we really would like growers to do is to have a really good idea on how successful they are at establishing a crop of canola. So as canola genetics get a little better, you start to buy more things in that seed package and the seed treatment package, the price tends to go up. So the grower's first reaction to that is, well, maybe I can save a half a pound of seed. So we've seen a tendency to cut seeding rate. We've seen a tendency perhaps to increase seed rate, seed place fertilizer usage. That doesn't really go together. You tend to burn a little more seed if you get a year like 2018 without rain. So if growers are honest with themselves, they should be going out there and counting their plant stands so they have a bit of an idea. Am I at 6 plants per square foot? Am I at 2 plants per square foot? We used to recommend 7 to 14. Now we're in the 5 to 8 range for plants per square foot. But a lot of growers don't actually check that, and they don't go out and look. And 5 plants per square foot can look actually really good from the road. Till you get a little bit of frost, or maybe your field is just a little tastier for flea beetles, and we saw a lot of that in this area last year. And suddenly your 5 plants are down to 2, and you've got a bunch of bare patches in the field. So now your stand establishment isn't up to par, and you're losing money. Okay,
I was going to ask you about flea beetles. What is there a forecast, or what are you seeing for the 19 season?
So there's no forecast for flea beetles.
Keith, come on.
No, there's no forecast for flea beetles. And in fact, I can't forecast across the road for flea beetles.
So you're like a weather guy. You just sort of like, I don't know.
Yeah, on flea beetles, we have said for years. I've asked the same question to people that are smarter than myself. You know, what can we do about flea beetles?
Yeah.
If you got really high populations in the fall when they're not really doing any damage, but if you've got a few green canola plants beside your bin or on the edge of the field, or you notice that all the leaves got chewed off with little small bites, it wasn't birth armyworms or something that's got big mouth parts. we can maybe speculate you might have more of an issue in spring, but really it boils down to in the spring is what kind of soil moisture conditions, emergence conditions have you got? Did your crop get ahead of any other particular pest or disease problem that's there? Do you have enough plants standing healthy in the field that you can afford to feed a few flea beetles? Or did you get unlucky and you got dry conditions and poor emergence, and now instead of being at that 50 to 60 to 70% emergence and establishment, maybe you're one of the unlucky guys that's at 25%. You don't have enough plants to feed those flea beetles, and if they happen to be moving slow, and suddenly you get some warm weather, and although I can't predict this, but you had a whole lot of them overwinter in the edge of the field or in the trash even in your field, all of a sudden they're chewing faster than the plant is growing at about 20 degrees Celsius. Gets a little warmer, they're really chewing fast. And you call me 10 days later and say, what's wrong with this field? And I look at it and say, well, your seed treatment was there. It was working for you. It only works for a couple weeks. And you probably should have sprayed a foliar insecticide 10 days ago. Unfortunately, in the Red Deer area, we looked at that in a couple fields this year where flea beetles really took most of that crop away.
I actually had a grower one time email me and say that their strategy was to go with lower seeding rates, less of a stand, because then their field was less appetizing for the flea beetles, and they would choose other fields. I was like, you might want to check on that. That's let me know how that goes.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a good strategy. You know, if the flea beetle stumbles over a lot of stubble from last year's crop, maybe it'll slow down. But no, it's a balancing act of how many beetles have I got. How effective is my seed treatment? I've had growers call and really be upset, and they apologize right at the start, and you know the phone call is not going to go well then. I'm not mad at you, Keith, but I got to tell somebody this. And it essentially boiled down to the idea that he'd bought, as good a seed treatment package as he could, and paid extra for it, and didn't realize that doesn't mean that your canola's bulletproof. Nothing makes canola bulletproof. So scouting's really the only way to go, and we've got a lot of management tactics and techniques that we can slip in there, but we still have to stay on top of the game. There's lots of things that like to eat canola other than you with your French fries.
We've been talking to Keith Gabert from the Canola Council of Canada. Keith, thank you very much.
Pleasure to be here.